Lecture 39, Thomas More.
Thanks to the successful play and even more successful movie of A Man for All Seasons, Thomas More, the man, is probably better known than Thomas More, the writer. I think of Paul Scofield playing the part of More. I look at the most famous portrait of More by Holbein, and it's sometimes hard for me to remind myself that this is the real one and Scofield is the copy. More often I think that Scofield is the real deal and that Holbein's is the copy. In any case, given the exemplary nature of his life, this might not be such a bad thing, but I think I'd like to try and redress the balance a little bit today by talking about his best-known work, Utopia, which was a big hit the first time around and has, I think, justly remained popular until the present. At first, it might seem to be pretty difficult to try and balance the life and work of More. He was an extremely talented lawyer and managed to work himself up to the most important office in England. He succeeded his mentor, Cardinal Wolsey, somewhat reluctantly, if accounts are to be believed, as Lord Chancellor of England. And he was the first layman, the first non-cleric to hold that post in English history. And then, the story is pretty well known, he came into conflict with King Henry VIII because of his refusal to acknowledge Henry as sole head of the church. He resigned in 1532, but he was charged with treason. He refused to deny the authority of the Pope or the validity of Henry's divorce from Catherine of Aragon, and he was executed in 1535. And the famous words in A Man for All Seasons, I die the king's good servant, but God's first, there's reason to believe that that was what More actually said. That is to say, the early biographies provide a mine from which the stage play and the movie got its material. In any case, you have this exemplary life and clearly a very serious one. More says, I draw the line here, and he kept to his word to his death. And it's that very seriousness, that high seriousness in the face of a kind of ultimate confrontation that makes the initial contact with Utopia so difficult, in many ways so stark. Utopia, written in 1516, is witty, humorous, playful, very, very hard to pin down. More took a pretty definitive stand in his life. Critics have been arguing for centuries about the position that Utopia asks readers to take, and, of course, by implication, what kind of stand More himself is taking. We talked a little bit in the last lecture about the way in which Erasmus and More were best friends. What Erasmus says of More is perhaps a good way to begin talking about Utopia. He says More had, from earliest childhood, such a passion for jokes that one might suppose he had been born for them. Utopia itself, what is it? Well, it's the story of an advanced New World society, an advanced non-Christian New World society. The character of More, who is in his own dialogue as a speaker, recounts the tale of Utopia as told to him by the explorer Raphael Hythlode, or Ralph No Sense, or Ralph Nonsenso, as it's translated in the Penguin edition. But problem number one is that More is a real person. Hythlode is a fictional character made up by More. So Utopia turns out to be an idealized communist, I use the word with quotation marks, and maybe there ought to be quotation marks around the quotation marks, society, perhaps a better way of stating it, a communal society, a place where there was no private property. But utopia is also a place where there is, in addition to no private property, few wars and little crime. This would have been seen, I think, in stark contrast to More's time, and it certainly should be seen in stark contrast to our own. And More, the character who is meditating on all of this stuff that Hythloday tells him about this great place, concludes that indeed, while some of the utopian practices are admirable, they're really not particularly feasible within the context of English society. Well, what makes this work so difficult to pin down? First of all, the kind of apparatus that he makes the reader go through before we actually get to the guts of the work make it very, very difficult to sort of see exactly what position a reader is supposed to take. It starts with what looks like a sort of computer gone wild on the page, which is really More's design for the utopian alphabet, entirely made up, okay, entirely nonsense. And then you have, of course, a transliteration of these utopian characters into English characters where they also make no sense whatsoever. You sort of read it all out, and it's just a lot of gibberish. Then it is translated into English. There's another level, which is a sort of 21st century irony. There's a very neat essay in the introduction to the Penguin edition of Utopia where the translator says, when I tell friends of mine that I am translating Utopia, they say, into what? Well, the reason for it is that they assume that it was originally written in English. In fact, it was originally written in Latin. Again, like Erasmus, part of this humanist circle for folks who are able to communicate with each other over a broad space in Europe, but again, a fairly limited group. And as if that weren't enough, More himself makes a wonderful joke in the middle of Utopia. He's talking about how he's trying to, or rather, his fictional character, Hythloday, is talking to these utopians, and he's hearing all of the good things about their society, and he's trying to think of something good about his own society that he can kind of give back to them. And he says, well, one of the things that you ought to do is become acquainted with the literature of our tradition. And he says that what I'd really wish is that you guys could all read some Greek literature. He says, we got stuff in Latin too, but nothing in Latin is really worth a damn. Well, again, it's important to realize that one of those, More well may be taking another shot at scholastic philosophy here about the way in which he sees Latin as being rather debased in his own time. But it's kind of interesting that what More is doing is playing a joke on himself, because, of course, it is Utopia itself which is written in Latin. So it's got that, and then there's a wonderful poem written on the island of Utopia to praise it by a man named Mr. Windbag. Again, I'm translating from the Latin, who is another fictitious character entirely made up by More. And the poem says, well, this is a really neat work. It's good or better than Plato's Republic. How seriously are we to take that claim? And More really think he's writing something better than the Republic. I think he's doing it tongue-in-cheek in one way, but in another way, what he's doing is something quite important. What he's trying to say is that there's a sense in which we want to use Plato's Republic as a frame of reference for what goes on in Utopia. And it's a sign of how well More has succeeded in this venture that frequently Plato's Republic is described as a utopia. When Plato describes the ideal community, one of the ways in which modern critics talk about it, when they quite frequently say Plato's utopia in Republic 4, well, that is at the very least an anachronism because, of course, the word utopia itself is a coinage by More. Plato's utopia is not a utopia because the word utopia is the word that comes from More's utopia. Which is to say of course, that More wants us to be aware of the etymological meaning of the word. Topos means place. U is one of those ways of saying no or non, and therefore utopia is no place, a non-existent place. So again, in claiming that it has all of these qualities that even outdo Plato, by the same token, we have to realize that he's constantly calling attention to the fictionality of it. And it continues. It really gets quite complicated. More writes a letter to a real friend of his, a person who really does exist, named Peter Gillies. And he says, all right, you were with me when I heard the account from Ralph Nonsenso, and when I wrote down all of this stuff that I heard. You were with me when he told me about the 5 years that he spent at this place called Utopia, and therefore you can attest. People are going to start to doubt this. People are going to really wonder whether this was real, whether this place really happened. You can help me. You can attest that it's real. Well, then Peter Gillies writes a letter to his friend, a man who also exists, but the problem with those two letters is that More wrote them both. And in the letter of Gillies to his friend, he goes into an encomium moriae, a praise of More, and says, boy, what a great book Thomas More has written, better than The Republic. And of course, it's better because, among other things, it was based on this real-life account. I was there, and so I can speak to his prodigious memory on the thing. The problem with it, again, in this letter from Gillies to Busleiden, is Raphael Nonsenso seems to have disappeared. There are rumors of strange things that happened to him. We don't know. So here's the problem. Again, we're talking now in this letter from Gillies to Busleiden. More's got this text, but doesn't know whether to publish it or not, because when people are going to go to try and find Nonsenso to find out if it's all true, no Nonsenso to be found. So he says, what's interesting about this account is I can see a lot more in it than Raphael could have seen in the time that he was there. In other words, it takes the reflection. Experience sometimes is not enough. It takes subsequent reflection on experience to tell what something means. Nonsenso has the experience. Nonsenso gives the experience to More. More writes it down. I can see more in More's account than there was in the original. Well, to the reader, that makes a certain amount of sense because, of course, Raphael doesn't exist. So all of this is a way of More preparing his reader for the fact that a lot of pretty wild sleight of hand is going to be going on in this text. Some of the concerns of More's own time and place are quite obvious. Things that we would call the concerns, the larger concerns of the Renaissance are apparent, one of which, of course, is the discovery, quote unquote, by Europe of the New World. Now, this is a little bit tricky to get at. One of the things we often read, especially if we look at textbooks that were written or derived from folks who wrote them in the 1950s, is that folks like Columbus discovered that the world is round. Nah. Educated people already knew that the world was round. Babylonians knew that the world was round. Greeks knew that the world was round. Romans knew that the world was round. Educated people in the Middle Ages knew that the world was round. What they thought was the world was smaller than it was. And so Columbus, thinking he's going to find the Indies by sailing west, reaches the New World. What are the results of what we sometimes call the Age of Discovery? Well, we know certainly in a political sphere the results were colonization, and if you happen to be Spain initially, an awful lot of Inca gold coming back to fill their coffers. But there's a literary version of Inca gold as well, a kind of literary gold of a sort, because this new vantage point of a new world also provides a new perspective for looking at one's own practices and beliefs. When I teach my humanities course, which starts with the ancient Greeks and sort of moves all the way up through Shakespeare's time, I tell my students that one of the advantages of going to the past is precisely the fact that they don't share our assumptions. And so we can look at them and question their assumptions. But it's also extraordinarily important, if we're perceptive students and if we want to get the most out of the class, that what we should do is to try to look at ourselves as though we were looking through the eyes of a Thucydides or a Herodotus, as though we are seeing ourselves the way Sophocles might have looked at us. And it seems to me that what the discovery of the New World provided for a number of the great literary artists of the time is exactly that sort of perspective, geographically distant as opposed to chronologically different, but that the results are really much the same, that there is this new way of looking at us. We will see later on when we're talking about Montaigne that he wrote an essay called On Cannibals, and that essay influenced Shakespeare later on, who's writing The Tempest, who do exactly the same sort of thing that More is doing here. That is to say, they're providing themselves with a context from which, a vantage point from which they can take a look at their present community. Well, what More does very carefully in the Utopia to make it difficult for us to immediately jump from one realm to the other is that this fictional world that he finds there turns out to be peopled with some real players, so that along with Raphael Hythloday, Ralph Nonsenso, we have references to Americus Vespucci, for example, who was very real. And so there's this sense of trying to have it both ways, to have a fiction, which your readers know is a fiction, but to remind them that there's a kind of reality behind the fiction that is provided for by the discovery of the New World. So what does he find in this New World, utopian, ideal community? He finds folks living according to natural law and natural religion. Natural religion, what's that? Sort of want to break out into a chorus now. Sometimes I feel like some natural religion. What natural religion turns out to be is nothing other than the fact that God reveals himself in the book of nature. St. Paul talks about this in the letter to the Romans, as a matter of fact, and says that there is a kind of universal revelation given to all people. And so this is not in any way a unique idea that More is playing with here. But what natural religion means in this context is that this sort of revelation, the stuff that is available to everybody simply by looking around and reasoning a little bit from what they see, is meant to be seen in contrast to the idea of some kind of special revelation. If you are a Jew, or if you are a Christian, you believe that God reveals himself in special events and through special people and through a body of texts which has come to be called Scripture, so that the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob, and for Christians, the God of Jesus, speaks in a very particular way, as opposed in a revealed way, as opposed to in a natural way. So here you have this situation in which people are living without the revelation that was given to Christians and Jews, and they're doing a very fine job of it. Thank you very much. In other words, here you have these utopians who are doing very well without the quote-unquote benefits of organized religion. Well, what are we to make of this? The most immediate take, the one that we're sort of tempted toward if we're simply reading it out of context, is that organized religion is a crock. Or if that's going a little bit too far, people without organized religion are better off. Here, I think it's a little bit more ambiguous, because I think that More might say that religion is, on the whole, a good thing. He is, after all, remember, a serious Catholic who is willing to give up his life for his beliefs, but he's also somebody who throughout his life was very interested in religious concerns and religious issues. In other words, it's not simply that he got religion at the end of his life when he was forced to make a choice. He was somebody who, for example, wrote responses, serious theological responses to Luther in 1523. Is there another way of looking at this? Well, I think one way of taking a look at it is that it suggests the very real possibility that when organized religion doesn't make us better, it might very well make us worse. And that this is, I think, a paradox that all religious people have had to deal with and seriously consider. And of course, in a way, it seems to me that he's getting at the same kind of thing that Erasmus was getting at in his satire of religion. That is to say, the fact that the beliefs and the practices really weren't going together in his own time, that there was a lot of what Erasmus would see as rank superstition, but not enough of the inner core. Well, utopia, looked at from this perspective, turns out to be a way of reminding us how far short we fall from our own ideals. If people without revealed religion are so good, then what excuse can we have for being so bad? So that I think it can certainly be taken as a critique of society in his own day, done in a very different way from Erasmus, but I think in terms of its fundamental message, very similar to what Erasmus was saying. So a good bit of the utopian project, then, is More's meditation on contemporary practices from the point of view of people who do it very differently. Let's talk about a few of those things. In Book 2 of Utopia, much of this takes place. In other words, there's a kind of commentary on the way utopians run their community. And one of the things that we find out is that utopia seems to be a very practical place in that things are valued because of what they can do. To put it in somewhat more specific terms, they value iron, they value water, they value good soil much more than they value gold and silver, which are essentially valuable according to what More says quite explicitly in Utopia, because of the value that we give them. Or to put it another way, the term that More uses, things are valued in Utopia because of their scarcity value. There lots of soil, lots of water, lots of iron if we're looking in the right places, not much gold and silver, so that's what we value. And More has all kinds of interesting things to say about it. He compares interest in, let's say, fine jewelry with kids finding pebbles on the beach and making beads with them. And he says that it really exists on the same level of sophistication. So that there's this kind of hard-nosed practical sense to the utopians, and what they seem to be, or what the book seems to be critiquing, is the way in which his own society, the new capitalism, if you want to put it in those terms, is always looking for more and more and more. Well, I was sort of thinking about this in terms of the recent example that was given to us by the art sale in the paper a couple of weeks ago, where Picasso went for $133 million. And what I think reading Utopia, as I was doing at the same time that this came out, forced me to ask is, what does that say about the intrinsic value of Picasso's great work, and what does that say about the fact that somebody's willing to pay for it so that nobody else can say they have it? Okay, one of a kind, that makes it scarce. What gives it value is not its intrinsic worth, but the scarcity. More spends a lot of time playing around with the notion of scarcity and sort of deciding that largely it's a crock, and largely it's responsible for the fact that our own society turns out to be a very acquisitive one. More also has an awful lot of interesting things to say about the laws of current day England, that is to say, England in his own time. He talks about the fact that there's a death penalty for minor crimes in his own society, and that's something that would have baffled the utopians. And indeed, that was true in England long after More's time as well. And More's take on this through the utopians is that that's a lot like an educational system where schoolmasters prefer to cane students than to teach them anything. In other words, if we think about the law as something that is primarily there to teach, and if we think about penalties as there primarily to teach also, what good is it putting people to death for relatively minor things? And to that, More adds something else, which I think on sober reflection kind of holds up. He says that if it turns out that people steal because of want, people steal because they're hungry, to put it in its most stark terms, if that's the only way that people are going to get food, people are going to steal no matter what the penalty is. Again, not a particularly new insight that More has here, but it certainly seems to be one that is congruent with the whole strain in utopia of a kind of reasonableness in the laws that we make up, forcing us to look at some of the unreasonable things of our own. What I'd like to take a look at now is a passage, or really a group of related passages close together in Utopia, where More talks about the law. I think that this is an important way to kind of bring our meditation on this work to conclusion, because it's a reminder that this is More talking about the subject that he himself knows best. And it's also something that reminds us that you don't get to be, you're a lawyer, you don't get to be Chancellor of England unless you're very, very, very good at what you do. And so I think he wants us to see that there's a difference between the law as a kind of process that you learn about and ultimate ways of thinking about what law is good for. And there's a sense in which so much of the simplification of the life of the utopians is there to show us how we miss the mark by missing the forest for the trees. Okay, he starts out by talking about public officials, and again, given the job that he's going to hold in a few years, there's no small irony here. More says, anyone, talking about the utopian practice, anyone who deliberately tries to get himself elected to a public office is permanently disqualified from holding one. It would be interesting to see what would happen to our political process if that were put into practice for 3 days. And then he goes on to talk about the law itself. He says that one of the things that distinguishes the utopians from us is that we have many, many laws, they have few. Interesting to think about what More would say if he were to come back and take a look at the complexities of our law. As a Law and Order junkie, that is to say the TV show, I'm always sort of fascinated at the case books that they pull down this big to find out the particular case that is most relevant. Anyhow, he says they have few laws because with their social system, very few laws are required. Indeed, one of their great complaints against other countries is that although they've already got books and books of laws and interpretations of laws, they never seem to have enough. For according to the utopians, it's quite unjust for anyone to be bound by a legal code which is too long for an ordinary person to read right through, or too difficult for him to understand. This is, I think, a nice spin off the notion in Plato's Republic, remember, where Plato says, you want the sign of a diseased community, it's when there are too many doctors and too many lawyers, people doing on the outside what folks should do for themselves. And finally, I think the most interesting thing is More's final take on what the law ought to be for. More says, that in utopia, everyone is a legal expert for the simple reason that there are, as I said, very few laws, and the crudest interpretation is always assumed to be the right one. What a great notion. They say the only purpose of a law is to remind people what they ought to do, so that the more ingenious the interpretation, the less effective the law, since proportionately fewer people will understand, whereas the simple and obvious meaning stares everyone in the face. Well, hard to find a better way to end than that, and a better way to make the claim that this is a work that is very much worth reading in our own time.